Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. We hope you're getting settled in. We will take your questions in just a few moments. At this time, you can go ahead and start to post them below in the comments section. While you do, I want to introduce our very special guest, the first African-American woman ever elected to the U.S. Senate, Ambassador Carol Moseley Braun.
Thank you. Okay, so what do I need to do? Oh, sorry. Start my video. Got it. Thank you. Well, congratulations for working out all this creative technical stuff to help us come together even in these difficult times. I also want to thank the people of New Hampshire for your kindness to me personally. When I ran for national office, the Granite State was as warm and welcoming and kind and hospitable to me as any in the country. And so I really want to thank you for that on a personal level. I want to congratulate also and commend all of you for this event, because there's nothing more important than voting and being able to vote and sharing information with people who would like to participate in our democracy so they can. This is such an important issue for our time. And again, I want to thank all of you who are involved with pulling this together and giving us a chance to have this virtual town hall meeting around this very important subject. I want to digress for a second and say that my screensaver on my phone is of my grandfather, who was one of 350,000 Black soldiers who fought for this country in World War I. And the fact is that at that point, he could not vote. Most Black people couldn't vote. This was before the Voting Rights Act, obviously. And so, but he went abroad to France and fought there for this country out of a sense of patriotism and out of a sense of wanting to participate in this great democracy. So it falls to us in our time to protect the gains that they made and to honor their sacrifice and their service by getting people, making it easier for people to vote. We have 65 years ago, the Voting Rights Act was passed in a way, in an effort to expand the franchise to people who had previously been denied the ability to participate in governance, in making our democracy work. And it was success even after the Supreme Court in 2013 rolled back part of it. The fact is the Voting Rights Act has been very, very important in giving people the ability to participate in self-governance. Because at the end of the day, that is the brilliance, that is the genius of democracy, is that it's government by the people, of the people, and for the people, that we're able to participate in making rules about how our government's going to treat with all of us. And so, again, thank you very much for organizing this. I am very happy to participate. It's my pleasure to be here. And again, it's my honor to have a chance to talk with Granite Staters again after all these years. So thank you very much. Am I doing something wrong here? Representative Melanie Levesque, thank you so much, because you were so nice to me when I came to New Hampshire before. I have never forgotten you for that reason. I wish we had been able to stay better in connection with each other over these years, but thank you again.
Well, hello, everyone. It's great to be with all of you tonight, and thank you so much, Ambassador Carol Moseley Braun, for joining us tonight. I do remember having you over and how excited I was to have you as a role model. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Senator Melanie Levesque, and I'm so excited to be here on this important day. As you know, today is the 55th anniversary of the signing of the Voting Rights Act. I believe that the right to vote is the foundation of our democracy. That's why more than half a century ago, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. This historic legislation was a triumph for the voters who were subject to generations of discrimination and for the activists who sacrificed everything for equality at the ballot box. Courageous Americans like Congressman John Lewis, may he rest in power. But today, that progress is under attack. Some politicians, driven by desperation, are deliberately trying to stop or make it harder for certain groups of people to vote. But what I believe is that when more people vote, democracy wins. That's why I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. And we're going to not talk about who to vote for, but rather how to register and vote. And with that, I want to introduce a few very special guests who are here to answer all your questions on voting. You can go ahead and start putting your questions in the comments below the video while I introduce these voting experts. Joining us tonight is Kelsey Clementowicz, the Voter Protection Director for Organized New Hampshire and a New Hampshire civil rights attorney. Maggie Goodlander, an adjunct professor of constitutional law at UNH Law, who has clerked for the Supreme Court and has advised the late John McCain. And Miles Rappaport, a senior practice fellow in American democracy at the Harvard Kennedy School, also Connecticut's former Secretary of State and the former president of Common Cause. And now let me turn it over to Kelsey, who will take all of your questions.
Thank you so much, Senator LeVake. It's such an honor to be here with all of you, and especially to be joined by Maggie Goodlander and Miles Rappaport. Just thank you so much for being with us. I'm particularly excited on this historic day to have these two people here with us. Maggie, who is a constitutional law professor and an expert, has a background of expertise in Shelby County, as well as election law and constitutional law generally. And Miles Rappaport comes to us really as an expert in innovation in election law, as well as with his own experience as a Secretary of State and experience broadly. So thank you both for joining us and for being here. So I guess I'll jump right into the questions that we have, and we'll start going, and then I'll have you all sort of give a larger introduction once we start passing off questions to you all. So, all right, the first question, I'll take this one. Do you have advice on the best way to vote this year and to make sure I'm safe and that my vote is counted? Great question, and yes, absolutely. The number one way to make sure that our elections go smoothly this year and to make sure that no one has to ever choose between their health and their right to vote is to vote early and to vote from home. For every voter who can, you should vote absentee in order to reduce spread of COVID-19 at the polls. You know, and I'll pass this off to, I think to Maggie next, but I just want to note that one of the main reasons why we need to make sure that those who can vote from home is to make sure that those voters who need to vote at the polls by reason of a disability or historical discrimination or a lack of a stable address are able to. And so when as many Granite Staters who can as possible can vote absentee and do so early, will really make room for our fellow Granite Staters. And Maggie, could I turn to you to talk a little bit more about the ways in which our election systems and COVID-19 might disproportionately affect some groups rather than others?
Yeah, well, Kelsey, thank you so much for everything you're doing to help all of us here in the Granite State vote safe and vote early. So the question of, barriers to entry, I mean, I think this is a really important 55th anniversary to commemorate, because the Voting Rights Act has done more to open the franchise and to really make voting in America what it should be, which is accessible and readily usable by all qualified voters and only qualified voters. We've encountered some roadblocks, largely through judicial decisions, and the most dramatic one was the one you mentioned before, Kelsey, the Shelby County versus Holder decision from 2013. And I think, there's a lot that can be said about the Shelby County decision, but the real upshot is one of the real difficulties in the aftermath of Shelby County has been widespread closure of voting polling places in this country. And so that it is part of the reason why we're seeing really long lines across the country. And so, one important thing that we've got to do here in New Hampshire is make sure we are fully mobilized to recruit as many poll workers as possible. Really, our election officials in New Hampshire and across the country are on the front lines of democracy, and we owe them all the help that we can give them.
Thanks, Maggie. And we've been seeing long lines and other issues across the country. This is another question. So what caused these types of issues? And do we expect to have these issues here? And I think that Maggie started answering this question by talking about one of the issues that we've seen across the country, which is when we have shortages of poll workers. That makes it very, very challenging to keep lines down for voters. And so something that we can all do as Granite Staters is to recruit our friends to step up if you can, and keep talking about the importance of being a poll worker to protect democracy. I want to pass this over to Professor Rappaport to tell us a little bit about yourself and your experience. And I'm particularly interested in what some states are doing to prepare for these elections during COVID, and some best practices that we can help to lay the stage for New Hampshire.
Thank you, Kelsey, and I'm very happy to be here with all of you. My experience comes from a neighboring state of Connecticut, where I serve both in the state legislature and as Secretary of the State. And I have generally been encouraged, I would say, by what is happening among secretaries of state and local election officials. Not without exception by any means. And there are certainly, a good number of election officials who are, I think, embarrassing the profession by making it more difficult to vote rather than easier. But I think there is a whole suite of policies that states can adopt, and New Hampshire has a good number of them, but not all, that make it more possible and more effective and easy, or accessible, I would say, not easy, for people to vote. Same-day voter registration, early voting, automatic voter registration, pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, expanded mail-in voting, particularly important this year. So what I see is that, in a number of states, the basic responsibility, it seems to me, of the election officials is to give the maximum number of opportunities and options to voters to vote. I think your advice, Kelsey, to vote from home is a good safety advice, but flipping it around to say, what are the responsibilities of the election officials? Some people should vote at home and they should be given the maximum opportunities to do that, postage paid and all. But some people are going to want to vote at the polls. And from that point of view, expanding the number of poll workers, making sure that the lines are not so long, arranging the polls so that they are safe for the people who do come, all those things have to happen in tandem with each other. And I think they can. I think there's still time. I think they can. I think the critical need at the moment is for the federal government to step up and put some money into the game, both to the Postal Service and to local election officials.
Thanks. And we just got a question. Chandon asks, do you foresee a situation in which people send in their absentee ballots early and then are not able to have those votes count? And the answer to that question is no. In New Hampshire, we are on very, very firm ground that any voter may vote absentee by means of COVID-19. So any person who is concerned about the spread or contracting of COVID-19 can vote absentee. And this is not going to change. This is now in the legislation, as well as we've had our law enforcement and our chief election authorities in New Hampshire state that COVID-19 is a valid reason under our existing constitutional and legal structure. So every voter can feel confident that this is a valid reason to do so. And just to address another question I saw in the chat, what's the difference between voting by mail and absentee? And I know we're using some of that phrasing interchangeably, so let me just address that quickly. We talk about voting from home, which is really by voting from home by casting your absentee ballot. Absentee was used because it sort of suggested that you were absent, but there are lots of reasons why you can vote absentee, including COVID-19, absence, disability, religious observance, and people who need to work or care for their children. So you can absolutely do that. And anyone who's concerned or feeling cautious about voting absentee, I do want to just note that in New Hampshire, we had some very smart people in the legislature who mandated that there be a statewide portal so that you can check and see where your application and where your ballot is. And so on our website, voteng.org, we have all of the steps to vote absentee up there, including checking and and confirming your ballot status. So you can go in and see, have they received my application? Have they sent out my ballot? Have they received back my ballot? And then any voter who wants to could also choose to vote in person instead of voting absentee. Up until your ballot gets fed into the machine, which cannot start up until 1 hour after the polls start, after the polls open, you can decide to go in person, and they will put your absentee ballot aside, give you an in-person ballot so that you can vote. So really being able to request your absentee ballot gives you options, just like Professor Rappaport had said, that what we want to do is make sure that every voter has as many opportunities so that every voter can vote absentee who is eligible to do so. A couple of questions here about, all right, I'll take the tough question. Do we need to be worried about what Trump is doing to the post office if we're planning to mail in our ballots? So first and foremost, I will say that this is why we should all vote early, right? It's one of those many, many reasons, is that we don't have to worry about any mail delays that could happen if we vote early. And so please, please, please get your absentee ballot application in now and get your ballot, as soon as they're available. And then remember that you can also always drop off your ballot in person at your clerk's office, or you can drop it off at the post office itself rather than putting it in the mail. But we would just recommend doing things notably earlier so that we don't have to worry about that. But as far as the Postal Service more generally, would either of you all like to take that?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. So I just add one thing, Kelsey. I think you're right. The ballot tracking tool on the Secretary of State's website is fantastic. Another really important development under New Hampshire law was that on the absentee ballot application or request form, you can already request your ballot for the general election. So it's both the primary election and the general. So you're going to take care of that first initial step right away. If hopefully today you'll go ahead and request your absentee ballot. We hope you'll do that if you haven't done so already. So on the Postal Service, USPS, Miles alluded to this earlier. Its funding is going to be crucial, and the New Hampshire delegation, I know, is fighting really hard to ensure that the post office, the Postal Service, does not go bankrupt. There's so much to say about the value of the Postal Service. It's one of the only administrative agencies mentioned in the Constitution itself. It's Ben Franklin was our first Postmaster General. There's an extraordinary history around the post office, and it's one of the most popular institutions in America, and there's a reason for that. What they do is extraordinary. What USPS does is extraordinary, and we should all have every faith in the Postal Service at the same time that we fight for them. And I think what USPS has said is very clear, which is exactly what Kelsey said. We've got to get our ballots in the mail if we decide to vote by using the mails, which again, you can drop them off. You can drop off your voted ballot in person at your clerk's office, but do so early. And right now, I think the best guidance we have is that it could take up to 15 days for your ballot, if you mail it, to be delivered. So take that into account if you do decide to put it in the mail.
Kelsey, can I just add a little bit of hot off the presses information? As everyone knows, there is a kind of heated negotiation going on Capitol Hill. And one of the major elements that is a priority, I think it has very significant bipartisan support, is to do a major infusion of money to the Postal Service to allow it to handle, plan for and handle the extreme volume. So I think the two pieces of kind of pro-democracy funding that are really required out of Congress, and I'm hopeful that we will see a fair amount of it, are the money for the Postal Service and the money for states to do the kind of upgrading of their election systems and hiring of poll workers and all of the things that are necessary. So hopefully, fingers crossed, in the next few days, we get some news on this, and it's good news.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm seeing a number of questions in the chat about sort of the specifics of voting. And so I think it might make sense to take a step back here and just talk through what those steps are in order to apply for, receive and submit your absentee ballot in New Hampshire. So the very first step is that you need to request your absentee ballot. New Hampshire is not a state with all mail voting. You're not going to get a ballot in the mail unless you specifically request it. So you should get that application and fill it out and submit it to your town or city clerk's office. We have these steps up on our website, voteinnh.org. If you go to voteinnh.org/absentee, that'll walk you through it. So that application itself, there's going to be a box on the top where you can check COVID-19 as the reason that you're requesting an absentee ballot. Also new on the form, as you can request both your ballots for the primary and for the general election with one form. So we're really recommending that everyone do that so that your request for the general election is in early so we can decrease some of the strain on clerks. Okay, coming back to the process. So I've submitted my application, right? I'm gonna fill it out. Make sure that you sign your form, and then you can fax, email, drop off, or mail that application to your town or city clerk's office. Then you can check that tracker to see where it is. You'll see that they've accepted it, and then see if they've mailed your ballot out to you. So then when I get my ballot, it's going to have 3 very important things in it. I'm going to get a broader envelope that's going to have actually my ballot and 2 envelopes. And actually, Savannah, or does somebody on our team have a graphic for that? Oh, Maggie, you got your graphic. Perfect. So here's our ballot, and you can see up top, on the top right, you'll see the very top of what your ballot looks like. Maggie, do you have yours live so you can show it in scale? And so when you get your ballot, you're just going to vote from home like normal. Perfect. And so you'd fill that out just the same way you would at the polls. And then you'll see that inside of it, there are 2 separate envelopes. So you'll need to return all 3 of these in order to vote absentee. So first, your ballot, you're going to vote it from home. Then second is your ballot envelope. And so this is the smaller envelope, perfect, with all of the writing on it, this one that we have second in line. And this is your smaller, what we call an affidavit envelope. And this is where you affirm that you are qualified to vote absentee. So note that they're still using the old envelope. And so just as a flag, it does not say COVID-19 on it. However, COVID-19 is absolutely a valid reason to vote absentee. And for me, I'm writing COVID-19 in there just to be extra clear, and we'd recommend that you would too. There's no question that you may vote by absentee because of COVID-19, and that technically counts. It's constitutional because it's underneath the disability category, but it doesn't mean disability in the same way that the ADA definition of disability does. So I'm going to write COVID-19 in there, and then I'm going to make sure I sign that envelope. The number one reason why clerks have to call voters and say, hey, there's an issue with your ballot, is because voters will forget to sign that internal envelope, or they'll forget to include that internal envelope. So make sure, check twice, make sure that you have signed that envelope. Okay, so my ballot is going to go inside that smaller envelope, and then I'm going to put that smaller envelope inside of that bigger election envelope. Perfect, Maggie, love the help. And so you see on the right here, there is not postage that is going to be affixed to this ballot. That writing there is not postage. That sticker is not postage. So if you are mailing your ballot, you're going to want to put 1 first-class stamp on it. All right, the Secretary of State's office, the post office have all confirmed that if you're sending back these 3 items, it should be 1 first-class stamp that you put on your ballot. If for some reason your clerk asks you for additional materials, you know, if you have to follow up on your registration, then you should put 2, but for just your ballot information, everything here, it is 1 first-class stamp. And then you'll see on both this graphic and on Maggie's that it is already pre-stamped with the Portsmouth Clerk's office. Maggie and I both happen to live in Portsmouth. And it has my return address up top. But so if it doesn't have it stamped on there, you should write it in. But that's all you do. The ballot, the smaller envelope, and then the bigger envelope. And then you're going to want to make sure that you personally hand deliver your ballot to your clerk's office, to your post office, or you mail it from home. Do note there's some very small exceptions to the personal delivery law, which is, you know, if my immediate family member, or, you know, say if I'm in a living situation, an assisted living situation, or have a disability, then someone else can drop it off. But in the normal course, you're going to want to drop this off yourself, and you're going to want to put it either in the hands of the post office or in the hands of one of your elections officials. And so you can reach out to your town and city clerk's office. I know a lot of towns and cities are allowing more opportunities in order to drop these off. I've heard from towns and cities who are going to be at farmers markets, out in their parking lot, so that there are lots of safe ways to vote this year. All right, thank you all so much. Anything to add to that, Maggie or Miles?
I just add that, so there was a question in the chat that's, I'll come back to what you just said in a second, but there was a question in the chat, which is a question about constitutional law, and there are very rarely clear answers in constitutional law, but in this case, there is a very clear answer. So I just want to quickly address it and come back to this point. So the question was posed, President Trump said suggested recently that he would consider delaying the election, the November 3rd election. And the question is whether he has the authority to do that. And the answer is categorically no, he does not. And all you need to do to know why that is so is to, I'll have one more visual assistant here, and that's the most important of all, the US Constitution. And all you need to do is just take a quick read of Article 2, Section 1, and it makes very clear that it is Congress's authority to decide the date of the presidential election. So I say this because it matters to me on a more personal note. I was born on Election Day, and I was born on Election Day in 1986, and it matters for three reasons, and I'll be very quick. The first is, well, I should say I was born in Ward 1 in Nashua. My mom's water broke when she was casting her ballot in Broad Street Elementary School. And it matters for three reasons. The first is that I'm really proud to have been born in Ward 1 in Nashua because we're represented by Senator Melanie LeVake, and she has been just an undying champion for voting rights in New Hampshire. And I'm just very proud to have been born in her district. The second reason is that on the day I was born, this was the day that Congressman John Lewis was first elected to Congress. And we're really here tonight in large part because of his patriotism, his courage, and his commitment, and his willingness to really give his own life for these values that we're here tonight. And but the third reason, and this comes back to voteNEA-NH.org and this process that Kelsey just described, which can sound a bit daunting, but I want to reassure you that it's not, because as I mentioned, it was my mom, she was casting her ballot. My mom has voted in person in New Hampshire for over 4 decades. And the idea of voting absentee to her initially seemed unthinkable until I suggested she take today to go to voteNEA-NH.org and start the process. And I wasn't sure how it was going to work out. She gave me a call about 20 minutes later. She has already completed step 1. And this is a person who has absolutely no computer literacy whatsoever. So I have faith in everyone who's tuning in tonight that you're going to be able to do just the same thing.
Thank you, Maggie. And thank you, Betty, Maggie's mom.
Many virtues, but computer literacy is not one.
Wonderful. Well, I want to just take a step back as we're sort of talking about this process. And I want to talk about the importance of voter education. I've been giving the example of the website that my team administers, voteNEA-NH.org, but we're joined by so many organizations in the progressive community in New Hampshire, and there are great options and great resources that are coming out of many in this community. For example, I think the ACLU has a wonderful website that is very helpful and very nonpartisan. So for those of you who may not feel comfortable sending people to a website that is managed by the New Hampshire Democratic Coordinated Campaign, there are plenty of other information out there from some of our amazing voting advocates in New Hampshire. But I wanted to take a step back and just talk about the importance of voter education, and especially how that interacts with making sure that there is ballot access for all. And I wanted to send this one to Professor Rappaport. Like, why is it important that voters have good, clear information? And how does this interact with our sort of history of discrimination and sort of our systemic issues that we need to be facing?
Well, I'd say it's a two-part answer. I do think that in some states, I don't think New Hampshire is one of them, there have been all kinds of hurdles that have been thrown up to people to cast their ballots. The movement of polling places, the voter identification laws that are strict, and a lot of different other things that have happened. And I think in those situations, it's really essential for voters to know what they're up against, to know and start in advance working through the process so that any of the hurdles can be overcome. This year, I think it's particularly important. There are going to be in almost every state changes in the way people vote. So the COVID-19 as an acceptable reason for a disability, or that's new in most states. The mailing of absentee ballot applications, or in some states, absentee ballots, is something that has not been done before, except for 5 or 6 states around the country. And so I just think it's, all of these things are going to come together, the safety issues, so that I think what's essential is that organizations, really tonight is a perfect example. There's some nice word description of when you are the example of the question that you're asking. So good for you. But anyway, I think that, all of the changes are going to require that there just be a tremendous amount of voter education effort from election officials, both local and state, but mainly from parties, from candidates, from organizations, everybody. I think we're going to have a very, very large turnout this year. I think people understand that there is an election, whatever side you're on, where a huge amount is at stake. And so I think that's going to happen. But I think that what may daunt people is just feeling like there are glitches or uncertainties. And from that point of view, voter education is absolutely essential. So congratulations again on what we're doing tonight.
Well, and thank you for being such an integral part of this effort. Maggie, do you want to talk a little bit about the information that's in New Hampshire and the barriers that you see for voters around education and information?
Yeah, I think one of 2016 in some ways feels like a lifetime ago, but one of the novel features of that election was it really was the first time in recent American history that we had a foreign government deliberately attempting to interfere and disrupt our election. And now we're all clear that this is happening, and that disinformation and misinformation are problems that we have got to deal with head on. So voter education is it's the defense and the offense. It's the defense, which is to stamp out and correct harmful misinformation. I think we've seen already in New Hampshire websites that appear to be legitimate, voter registration websites, some of which even have, the imprimatur of the White House. These are websites that just actually are not the right sites, or that don't have the right forms for you to use to register to vote or to request absentee ballots or to vote absentee. So I think, this is the value of websites like votenh2020.org and votenh.org. These websites will bring you, as you'll see when you hopefully have already gone on, or when you will tonight go on to request your absentee ballot, you'll see that it'll bring you to the right places on the Secretary of State's website for you to complete the different steps of this process. And the value of these two websites are that they really will walk you through step by step in a clear and incremental way, so it's not overwhelming, and so that it's thorough. Because as Kelsey said earlier, it's really easy to miss almost any of the basic steps here, from the signature to the way, affixing postage. So I think we've all got to really be operating from the same basic set of information, and that's the beauty of these websites. But Miles, I wonder if you could say more, because as Secretary of State of Connecticut, I imagine you dealt with this in we've got the problem in some ways has magnified and become more complicated given the digitalization of so much of election administration. But I imagine you've encountered misinformation and disinformation in various forms during your time as Secretary of State, but also during your tenure at Common Cause as well.
Yes, for sure, and I think you're right. 2016 was the kind of moment of awakening about it, but I do think that this year, all indications are that that there will be new and interesting and innovative in a negative way, ways of casting out misinformation and trying to make sure that voters feel confused and feel uncertain and aren't sure what's going to happen. And so I think genuine, serious, straightforward public education is absolutely essential. I wanted to add one point though, which is interesting because we've been talking about absentee ballots and how to vote. Obviously, absentee ballot applications and ballots are only sent to people who are already registered. But you will encounter maybe some people on the call are not registered, but in terms of the work that you're doing, you will encounter many people that are not registered. And of course, New Hampshire was one of the early states to adopt same-day voter registration. Interestingly, when I was Secretary of the State in Connecticut, there were only about 6 states that had same-day voter registration. Now there are 22, counting the District of Columbia, that are going to be offering people same-day voter registration. So it's really an incredibly useful tool for people to who get into the process late, for students who are kind of arriving, if they're arriving in a new place. So I want to make sure that people are including in their education work the ability for people to register and vote on election day or during any of the early voting periods.
Yeah,
100%.
Same-day registration is really important.
Yeah, well, and that actually leads us to a couple of questions in the chat that are on these subjects. So first, there's just a question, I think, about what's the difference between misinformation and disinformation. And just very briefly, both are information that are out there that serve to dissuade or confuse or suppress voters. Disinformation is when it's intentional. Misinformation is sort of regardless of intention. So even a well-meaning person who is giving bad information continues to be harmful for voters. And that's something that you need to broadly address. And so, please call our hotline if you see misinformation or disinformation out there. We have our voter assistance hotline that is staffed by attorneys who are trained with our program, and that is 603-GO-AND-VOTE, 603-466-8683. I'm sure someone on our team will drop that in the chat. Stepping back from that, I want to talk a little bit about voter registration and how important this is both for voting rights more broadly, as well as I want to ground this in Shelby County's, or rather the Voting Rights Act's goal of making sure that especially voter registration is accessible for all. And with COVID, we're really facing, it's not new laws, but it's new circumstances that are threatening voter registration in a way that we haven't seen in the past. Especially in New Hampshire, we have a challenge that I know we can all rise to, but I want to talk about it. And because same-day voter registration has been an amazing tool in New Hampshire to cure a lot of ills we have, right? If we have, someone who is young or has some housing instability, we didn't have to work on the education around voter registration so much as you want to vote, great, let's get you to the polls on election day and our amazing elections officials will walk you through this, right? That's been so much of our registration effort was you can and you should register, go to the polls. We don't know what November 3rd is going to look like. And right now it is very, very challenging to register by mail. It's a somewhat opaque process. However, as we're talking about, there are a lot of resources out there and people who can help. So I want to talk about the ways that we can register and the ways that we can talk to people about getting them registered and getting them registered early. And if you are a local elections official or a city councilor, I saw that Councilor Paradis had asked a question in there, and I'm sure that Somersworth is on top of this. But a lot of our towns and cities are holding a lot of early registration events. We don't have classic registration drives in New Hampshire. However, the towns and cities can make the decision to say, hey, we're gonna have these events, so come on in and we'll help you register. And so I know that some places are having their supervisors of the checklist or their clerks or other staff from their office walking people through the registrations at, in the parking lots of their town halls, farmers markets, everything we talked about earlier. But for registration, this is incredibly, incredibly important. So I would recommend anyone who is active in this or who wants to be to call your town and city clerk's office and see what options they'll have for young people or people who have just moved to their communities to register now. The number one classic way to register ahead of election day is to do so in person with your clerk. It is very, very easy. You can contact your clerk's office, and some clerks are doing safe registration appointments. Others will say, nope, we're open during these hours, come on in, and you can go in and register in person. In order to register in New Hampshire, you have to be 18, domiciled, which means live in New Hampshire, a US citizen, and you have to be who you say you are, right? So I can go in and show all four of those things, show my ID, my citizenship, where I live, and that I'm 18 or older. Or if I don't have that proof, I can swear to my clerk that I'm qualified and sign an affidavit in lieu of having proof. So it is very, very easy to vote in person with your clerk's office. So please, please, please encourage anyone who has moved or who is, a new voter to please register early by contacting their clerk's office. Our clerks are there to do it anytime they are open, and call them for additional options. Like, our clerks have a lot on their plates this year and they're really rising to the challenge. But we all want everyone who needs to register to please register early, so that, because we don't know what November 3rd is going to look like. We don't know. We don't want long lines for people who need to register. So please, please register early. And you can, yeah,
and also wear a mask.
Yes, well, always, right? Wear a mask, bring your own pen, make a safe registration appointment, and then at the polling places, bring all of the PPE you can. I do know there have been, our local elections officials have been meeting with our Secretary of State's office, as well as with our public health officials to make sure that there are safety precautions in place. And there are a couple of questions about this in the chat that I'll address, that our poll workers will all be provided with PPE from the state. They will have those, the plexiglass shields, as well as N95 masks. And, there will be, lots of PPE out there to be safe. I do want to talk about how, if we don't act on this, if we don't really motivate young people and new voters to register, that this could have a real disproportionate impact on those communities that the VRA had sought to, and does still seek to protect. In New Hampshire, Maggie, do you have a sense of what our same-day registration percentage is and who those voters usually are on election day?
So in general, the trend in New Hampshire, and I think, Miles, you'd know more about Connecticut, but my sense is that in New England more broadly, the numbers for in-person election day voting and registration are pretty off the charts compared to the rest of the country. So in New Hampshire, in the last several years, the numbers are really between 90 and 95% of voters who are showing up in person on election day. So I think, we've got a great tradition of this in New Hampshire, but it's COVID has been a wake-up call and an opportunity, I think, it's a wake-up call in the sense that our primary, which proudly is, first in the nation, was February 11th this year. And at the time, there were few hundred reported cases of COVID-19 outside of China. If our primary had fallen, or if the virus had reached the United States just a few weeks sooner, there's no way that New Hampshire could have had the First in the Nation primary this year. It would not have been successful because we didn't have the infrastructure in place to do absentee registration and voting, because we relied so heavily on same day. So it's really remarkable what we've been able to achieve in the last couple of months to get ourselves ready to offer, and this is where the opportunity comes, optionality. You know, we have now this year the chance to choose which way, you know, live free or die, baby. You can decide which way you want to vote. If you want to be there in person, or if you want to exercise the option this year to vote by absentee ballot and to register by absentee. I just want to emphasize though, Kelsey, on the registration piece. Although yes, it is a more complicated process in some ways, I am again encouraged. I was talking to someone earlier today, a volunteer who had walked a voter through from start to finish the registration process using voteNH.org in less than 20 minutes. So it can be done.
And it must be done.
Right. Let me make an interesting kind of long-term point in a way, which is that I think that the adjustments that are being made and the innovations that are being made to allow for voting to take place in the midst of COVID-19 are actually a template for what should be happening long-term and permanently. And the shorthand way of saying it is simply to give voters the maximum opportunities to participate. So same-day registration, automatic voter registration, early voting. You know, New Hampshire has some of these things, but not all. You know, early voting, pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, significantly expanded mail-in voting. So anyway, so I think that what I'm hopeful of is that, you know, like many crises, what happens this year in states that make the adjustments and you know, kind of step up as you're describing New Hampshire is doing, will make those things permanent, and we'll make sure that we have every opportunity for people to be allowed to vote going forward in the future.
Can I just add one thing to that? I agree, Miles. These are, in some ways, they're innovations, and this is a chance for us to look ahead and build on what we're doing now. But in some ways, it's actually really going back to basics. So New Hampshire, one of the first known in history, in American history, one of the first known instances of absentee voting was actually right here in New Hampshire, in Hollis, New Hampshire, for a town meeting. There were some Revolutionary War soldiers who were on their way to join the unit that was commanded by the hero of Bunker Hill, the Battle of Bunker Hill, and they cast ballots in absentia, essentially absentee ballots. This is in 1775, so the history is long. This is not some, you know, modern invention. There's a long and great tradition of finding ways. We're Americans at the end of the day. Like, we're gonna make it work. We're gonna find a way to make it work. We always have. It's what we're doing now, and we can just continue to build on it.
Thanks, Maggie. Yeah, and it just, you know, as far as we're talking about like moving backwards or moving forward, like, you know, these elections will work, and it is largely because of the incredible efforts of this community in educating voters. But we are behind on, you know, a lot of the processes and technologies that would make this process more accessible, particularly for voters with disabilities, young voters, and newer voters. And, you know, we're so lucky to have been kicked off here by Senator LeVake, who has sponsored a number of bills which have been vetoed time and time again, including in the last 2 weeks, that had they not been vetoed, would make this process so much more accessible and so much easier and so much more confidence inspiring for our voters. And I just, you know, I want to credit Senator LeVake, and also to talk about how, you know, it's by like the sheer power of this community that we're going to make this happen. However, if the online voter registration bill, if the SMART Act, if no excuse absentee voting, if these tools to make registration more accessible and online, for example, wouldn't it be great if on our website we could then point someone to a secure portal that is attached to their DMV files in order to register to vote. So, you know, there is a long way that we need to go in the future, and we have amazing advocates here who are working on that. But I do want to just note that these advances that would have made this more accessible and easier were vetoed. And just to thank the people who have been working tirelessly, who are our co-sponsors here, in order to make this more accessible now and in the future. And I think COVID-19 really brings that into stark focus, because Maggie, your comment about our February primary, where, you know, it's now taken us months to get to a point where we feel like we can have confidence in administering a free and fair election where no one has to choose between their health and their right to vote. But had we had these reforms in place, it would have been much easier. And so that brings me back to a question that we had in the chat, which was, you know, are polling places in New Hampshire shutting down? How do I know that my vote is going to be counted? And I want to address those sort of head on. So first, polling places in New Hampshire, it is constitutional. We must keep open a polling place in each town or ward in New Hampshire. So the polling places will stay open, but let's make it easier for our local elections officials and help them recruit and engage poll workers. So it's not even a question, right? We would love to have, you know, 17-year-olds can work the polls. These are good jobs. You get paid. And you can be there and serve democracy and be able to step up. And so let's keep recruiting and encouraging our young people to step up there to make it easier. But yes, they're going to stay open. And then another question about security. You know, how do I know that my ballot is going to be safe? And, you know, what's going on with early processing? And I know that Maggie, you had a hand in advising some of the legislation that was passed with HB 1266. Do you want to talk a little bit about those early processing sessions and how that interacts with sort of voter confidence?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, so if we just go back to this nifty ballot here, so again, to highlight, you see this barcode here. The barcode is, this is the tracking device. So if you do decide to exercise your option to vote by absentee ballot, you'll have this tracking device, which will tell you, you know, when your ballot's been returned and it's in place. And one of the great features of this new legislation that was passed and signed into law last month is that it does take a long time. So I know we had some of our frontline heroes in democracy, or some of our election officials who have tuned in tonight. And I think it's amazing when I listened to some of New Hampshire's election officials explain the process that they have to go through in order to just process absentee ballots. You'd be amazed how much time and care and attention it requires of them, because as Kelsey sort of helped walk us through just a few minutes ago, there are two envelopes involved. And I saw a recent calculation just of the amount of time it takes for election officials to go through these ballots, and it's really extraordinary. So New Hampshire law had previously required all of the processing, which again is, you know, really just a matter of receiving these two envelopes, separating the envelopes, checking off names, so not counting the ballots themselves. But the processing and the tabulation had to all happen on a single day, on election day. This new law has now given election officials some breathing room to begin the process of getting the ballots ready for tabulation before election day. So this is a really important development and will help ease this process a great deal. And so I think we should all have confidence in that. You know, these are the sort of the transparency features, the tracking device. But I've seen, you know, across the country, and Miles, maybe you can speak to this as well. We've seen across the country ways, really creative ways that election officials have brought transparency to various stages of the election process. So back in April, for example, one example that comes to mind, in Ohio, there was a county that you know, knew it was going to have a heavy lift to process and count absentee ballots. And so they decided to live stream to make this process open and accessible to the public, so that there wasn't any sort of shroud of secrecy or uncertainty about it. And you know, these kinds of innovations, I think, you know, we should look for them and try to encourage them wherever possible, so that voters can see and be a part of and understand what's happening in the democratic process.
Now, I want to go back to one thing very quickly that Kelsey was talking about, online registration. You know, just for a little bit of context, there are now 40 states where you can register online. You know, this is a reform that has been adopted really quite rapidly over the last 10 or 12 years as, you know, technology has advanced. Same with automatic voter registration, where people are automatically registered when they go to their Department of Motor Vehicles. Oregon was the first state that did this just about 3 or 4 years ago, but we are now in a situation where there are 17 or 18 states where automatic voter registration is the norm, and I think it will become increasing. So I think, you know, fighting for our democracy and for it to work as well as it can is not just about election time. It's an all year round. So I would urge the people in your community, which is obviously a vibrant and active and community, to take a look come the legislative sessions of 2021. You know, it'll be a new kind of political day, so to speak. We don't know exactly what it will hold, but it'll be new. And just see where New Hampshire stands relative to the other states and relative to the states that are really on the cutting edge. Colorado, Minnesota, California, you know, have done a lot of things that have that really, you know, in some really gotten their turnout levels way up. And I think that's a really important thing to do. So those are your marching orders for 2021.
Thank you. And it is clear that around the country, places that have made it easier to vote, or rather more accessible to vote for eligible voters, their turnout has gone way up. So that is really encouraging. 538 just issued new numbers on that for this year's primary. I think it was striking. And as we're seeing early returns coming back for people who have already requested your absentee ballots, those numbers are already significantly higher. In some communities, we're seeing already for the primary more requests for absentee ballots than came in for all of the 16 primary in those communities. So I want to get, it looks like a lot of folks have sort of specific questions that I want to make sure that we are addressing. And this one is a good way to follow up from the automatic and online voter registration conversations, because we don't have online voter registration, and you do need to go in person or go through the absentee process. This makes it particularly challenging for college students to register without us reaching out and making sure that they have the info they need. So I want to spend a little bit of time about talking about college students and questions around college student voting and accessibility. So I had a question from Rose. What if a college student registers where they're a student and then they are sent home to COVID before the election? This is a really good and interesting question, and I'm going to go ahead and plug my website, voteNNH.org. We have the FAQs up, and we just put up a college student voting section, which actually has the answer to this question, as well as to the other surrounding questions. But, basically, if you move to New Hampshire, if you come here for college and you have physically made your presence here, and New Hampshire is your it's the place where you live, it's the place where you choose to be, it's your civic home, it's like where I engage in my community. I can choose to register and vote in New Hampshire if I am a college student here. I am eligible to vote because I am domiciled, meaning I live here, and I have established my physical presence. If there's COVID-19 and all of a sudden I'm in my parents' basement in Kentucky, my parents are in North Carolina, but my deputy, fun fact, is in her parents' basement in Kentucky. But if I'm a student and I need to go back to stay with my parents because I don't know what's happening and I have to take classes online, I do not lose my domicile here, right? I've already established my domicile, I've established my physical presence. And so I am eligible to vote unless and until I make a new place my home, right? So any temporary absence is just a temporary absence, and this remains my home. If I'm a college student and I've graduated or I'm about to graduate and I'm like, you know what, I'm never going back to New Hampshire and I've made a new home here and I'm staying here forever, I should vote in the new place, right? But that's different than being temporarily absent and wanting to come back to New Hampshire. right? So just sort of walking us back through it. You know, you're a freshman, you want to move to New Hampshire as soon as you can on campus, but you haven't been here. You're going to, you know, classes online at, say, Dartmouth. You cannot register to vote here, right? You have to establish a physical presence. You need to have moved here and made it your home and physically been here. However, if you're a freshman who has moved onto campus and you've physically been here and then you're displaced, you're fine. You can vote here if this remains your home. Hit me in the chat if there are other follow-up questions on this, because I know this is sticky, but actually I will go ahead and say, go to voteinh.org and go through those FAQs. And also, this is another great place for our hotline. Our hotline volunteers have all of the sort of legal outlines of what this looks like, so they can give you the information so that you can make your own decision on where and where you should register, where you're eligible to, where you are eligible to register and vote.
These are amazing volunteers who have both the expertise, but also the extraordinary patience, which is really fueled by passion for the democratic process. So this is an amazing resource, these hotlines and the extraordinary team of volunteers who are going to be staffing them. I think there was a question, Kelsey, about early voting in New Hampshire, which, you know, we are a state that does not, generally speaking, have early voting. But again, one of the features of these changes in the law that were made for this year, COVID, is that you can start voting. You know, you can get your ballot, you can request your ballot today, and you can get your ballot, you know, as soon as your clerk is able to process and get it to you. And then once you get that, yes, the question was, how early can you submit that ballot? You can submit it right away, and you can do it as we've talked about. There are a variety of ways to return your absentee ballot once you've voted it, by mail, you know, by dropping it in the mailbox or in a USPS mailbox. But you should be sure, if you want to find a way to deliver it by hand, to call your clerk and find out how exactly you can do that, because there's some great innovative approaches that clerks across the state and election officials across the state are taking to help facilitate, to give you several different options for how you can return your ballot. So there's no limit on how early once you've received your ballot. And then a related question was, can you return your voted absentee ballot on election day? And the answer is yes, you can. You can do that.
Thanks, Maggie. And just to be extra clear about that, we don't have sort of what we call early voting. However, you may vote by absentee in person. So basically your clerk's office is going to get your ballots about 30 days before the election. For the primary, it was a little early this year. And so once your clerk's office has those ballots, I could walk in and do the whole absentee voting process and register all in one really quick session, right? Because I can walk in, the clerk will give me the application, I'll fill it out, they'll hand me my ballot. Most clerk's offices even have the voting booths where you can go over and do it. And I know so many clerks, you know, especially like Portsmouth City Hall is amazing. You can make an appointment and go in, and they have social distancing and masks. And so you would go one at a time in to meet with your clerk. And so it's as safe as it can be. All right. Other questions? Oh, if there's an issue with my ballot making it ineligible, will I be given an opportunity to correct it so it will count? I love this question because it gives us an opportunity to talk about these early processing sessions that were part of HB 1266 that we had, I think, just touched on very briefly earlier. And so normally, in a normal year, at the polls, your absentee ballots would be counted by your moderators and their assistants sort of during the day. And so with a higher proportion of absentee ballots, that's then a lot of work for them during the day. So they would have to, you know, if they're opening it up, taking a look, great, you have your ballot, your inner envelope, that's signed, great job, and to feed it into the system. But it's going to be tough when they have a lot of these, as well as people who are registering and voting in person at the same time. So HB 1266 allowed for early processing sessions where any ballot that comes in to your clerk's office more than about 6 days before the election, before the Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or Monday before, they can then take those ballots and go through and check off all of those early processing steps. So that means that my, my supervisors of the checklist and my moderators down at Little Harbor in Portsmouth Ward 5 would take my ballot because they've received it, and they can have a meeting, which is going to be open to the public, fully noticed, where then they will go through and they will open just that outer envelope, go in, take a look, make sure that my ballot is signed and that my information matches the checklist. And if there's an issue, they would then contact me, right? That's why it's so important to put your phone number and your email address onto your ballot so that they can contact you. And also another reason why it's really important to get your ballot in early so that it's processed during that early processing session, so that there is time for you to be able to fix that, right? You could come in, you can fix your ballot, you can vote a new ballot, you could come in on election day and vote a ballot to replace your absentee ballot. So lots and lots of options. So again, another reason why it's important to get it in early. And there was a question about security in here, and the law requires that they open up the outside envelope, check everything, and then they reseal it all. It is done with the moderator in the presence of at least 3 other elections officials, and then it is sealed back away in the same way that all absentee ballots have been sealed for years. So this is a safe and process that we can feel confident in. I got a question from Anne. My clerk told me that I had to submit my ballot by 5 p.m. the day before the election. Is that correct, or is it bringing in on election day okay? So this is a topic that is being worked out with the Secretary of State's office and the AG's office. There will be clear guidance that should be coming out with their new manual so that all of the clerks should have consistent information. There's been, I think it's fair to say, a little bit of an information gap from the statewide level as to what our clerks and supervisors should be doing. The law is very clear. If you mail in your ballot, it needs to arrive by 5 p.m. on election day. A delivery agent, so this is like, again, if I'm disabled and I have an assistant or an immediate family member, must be able to drop off my ballot at the polls up until 5 o'clock on election day. In addition, under HB 1266, the law provides that all absentee ballots should be accepted at the polls on election day. That was made very clear during the supervisors of the checklist meetings and that the Secretary of State has been having, and the election committee. So we're really recommending that local elections officials do drop-off spots where you can drop off your absentee ballot, where they have a staffed drop box. So they have an election official who is there to take your ballot, so that if you want to go and drop off your absentee ballot, you don't have to go inside. Remember, voting inside is always a backup option. But it would be really great for all of our towns and cities to allow these safe staffed drop boxes on election day to decrease the number of people who can go into the polls. And I know a lot of places are allowing people to fill out their absentee ballots at tables, an absentee ballot request, and do your absentee ballot so you don't have to go inside if you have a pre-existing condition or you're otherwise concerned about being in an enclosed space and the likelihood of a spread of COVID. So back to top lines, yes, you can drop off your absentee ballot. If you're mailing it, make sure it gets in before 5 o'clock on election day. And number 3 goes back to the thing we've said over and over and over again. Let's not put our clerks in the position where we have to where they have to deal with stuff same day. Let's get them in early for everyone. Please just promise while we're all here, I want to hear from everyone in the chat, please promise to get your ballots in early if you're voting absentee.
But these are all common sense solutions. I mean, the whole purpose of opening up this new option for voting absentee is so that you don't have to make this choice, which is not a choice any person should have to make. It's a choice we've seen people have to make across the country since March, and it's unacceptable. You shouldn't have to choose between your health and your right to vote. And that is why innovations, like very simple innovations actually, that are just not dissimilar to USPS blue boxes, which are these canonical boxes. These are safe and secure methods of transmitting the mails. Same deal with drop boxes. So no one should have to go into a polling place on election day. And we need to support our election officials on the ground across the state to make sure that that's possible to avoid.
But as Miles had mentioned, the other part of this is making sure that in-person elections are always accessible, that we keep our polling places open, and that we're making sure that we're supporting them to allow access to all voters. And again, it's disproportionately voters who are disabled, who are young voters, and voters of color, new voters, and new Americans, who we really need to make sure that we support. And to that, I'm going to go ahead and answer the last question. And this is well, let me look at the chat and make sure if I missed anything. If I have, we're going to get in touch with you to make sure that we're addressing your questions, but also go check out our FAQs. But I see a great question on the same topic, which is Will asks, do any additional towns need ballot clerks? What should people do if they want to get involved as poll workers? Will, I'd love you for this question. Yes, absolutely. We need to make sure that everyone has enough ballot clerks. And now I know a lot of people did step up before in sort of our last round of recruiting, but we need every town or ward could use some more poll workers. So please, 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 if you're interested in working the polls, to reach out, you can reach out directly to your local elections officials. I know that some people in the New Hampshire Coalition for Voting Rights are recruiting people and making sure that they're connected with their clerk's offices. We at the party are still recruiting. So we have that up on votenh.org/volunteer. And just, huge shout outs to everyone in this community who are doing your part to recruit poll workers and to make sure that we're following up with them and making sure that, if someone has something that happens, closer to the polls and for some reason can't do it, we want to know that so we can know that we need to recruit more, which is why we're asking for people to sign up and let us know, as well as letting your clerks know, so that we can start helping them to make sure that when we need to send more poll workers, we'll know that. So absolutely sign up, spread the word to sign up. And yeah, go.
Kelsey, let me, go ahead, Maggie.
No, just tonight, I mean, this statistic is haunting. It haunts me. In April, Wisconsin moved forward with its primary when there was, we were sort of seeing the height, this was early April, the height of early in the pandemic and so much uncertainty about what was going to happen. One thing we know for sure is that election officials in this country, again, are just such extraordinary patriotic Americans, but most of them are over the age of 65. And so that is why we saw in this statistic in Milwaukee, ordinarily there are 170 polling places. In the April primary, there were 5, primarily because poll workers, for totally understandable reasons, were unable to go to the polls safely and to be able to work safely, which is why we've got to recruit poll workers and why we need to protect our poll workers with more PPE, as much PPE as they absolutely would ever imagine they needed.
This is another example where I think, hopefully this crisis will be the impetus for change, because this is a national issue. I mean, all around the country. Certainly, I know it from my experience in Connecticut. Poll workers are underpaid. They're mostly, senior citizens who have, toiled in the party for a long time. They have to get there at 5 o'clock in the morning to get the polling place open. They stay all day. It's an incredibly long shift. And we ought to treat poll working as if it were a real and serious job. So people who work the polls on election day should be paid better. Companies should give their employees time off to go and be poll workers, not just to vote. The state and city governments should allow state and city employees to serve as poll workers on those days. High school students, Kelsey, you mentioned this earlier. If you're 17, you can do this. Anyway, I think we ought to use this as an opportunity to have a much bigger, much more diverse, much better paid, much better working conditioned workforce for elections. And hopefully that will be one of the results that come out of this year's election.
Amen.
Seriously. Well, and with that, I will just thank everyone so much for being here. And now that I can turn my attention to it, I'm going to jump on and answer some of the questions that are still coming in on the Facebook feed. So just again, Maggie, Miles, what a pleasure. Thank you all for being here. And to Senator LeVake and to Carol Moseley Braun, it's such an amazing pleasure to have you all here and to be able to, well, attempt to follow that. So thank you all so much.
Great. Go New Hampshire.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.